Okay, welcome back. We're going to follow the SQ3R through the rest of this. Remember, we've scanned it and we've questioned our purpose, and our purpose is to look at how societies following the decline of Rome, how they struggled to try to rebuild some type of a political and social order, the Germanic societies that would succeed Rome in Europe. And we looked at section one, which talked about how Charlemagne attempted to create a new Roman Empire, but it didn't last very long. So we're going to look at the second section, which is called feudalism in Europe. We'll read along here. That starts right here. Between 800 and 1000, Europe was threatened by new invasion. Muslims captured Sicily and southern Italy. The Magyars, who by the way are present day Hungarians, the Magyars struck from the east. From the north came the most feared fighters of all, the Vikings or Norsemen. So the first paragraph kind of sets up the reading. So we're going to be looking at invasions here and how those invasions created a need for order. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, now Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. In small, quick raiding parties, they attacked villages and monasteries. They took anything of value. The Vikings struck terror in the heart of Western Europe. By around the year 1000, though, the Vikings had adopted Christianity and stopped raiding and became traders and farmers. So we may have read about the Vikings before. You might have pictured the long ships or the helmeted, the horns on the helmets. Yeah, that's for the Vikings. Okay, so of course, then they really created havoc in Europe. The Magyars, Turkic, not really Turkish, but they're Turkic nomads, attacked from the east and reached as far as Italy and western France. The Muslims invaded what is now Spain and Italy from the south, and the worst years for the invaders' attacks were from 850 to 950. People in Western Europe suffered and feared for their futures. With no strong central government, they went to local leaders for protection. In this way, Europe's feudal system began. So you remember that the invasions had kind of destroyed Rome's order. There's going to be a second period of invasions between 850 and 900 CE. And again, the idea of looking for local assistance and protection is going to be part of the issue here. Okay, so we have the feudal system was based on right and obligations. For example, the local leaders or lord gave land to a person of a lower status called a vassal. In return, the vassal promised to supply soldiers when the lord needed them. The structure of feudal society was like a pyramid. At the top was the king. Next came the powerful vassals, such as nobles and bishops, and beneath them were knights, mounted horsemen, who pledged to defend their lord's land. At the bottom were landless peasants who toiled in the fields. This is the way government was organized. Peasants were by far the largest group. Many of them were not free to move about as they wished. They were tied to the land of their lord. The lord's land was called a manor, and the manors became the center of economic life. Lords gave peasants land, a home, and protection from raiders. The peasants worked the land to grow food, giving a part of their year's crop to the lord. They also paid taxes every year and had much of their lives controlled by the lord. Peasants lived in small villages of about 15 to 30 families. They found everything they needed in that small community and rarely traveled from their homes. Their cottages had only one or two rooms with straw mats for sleeping. They had poor diets. They endured these lives believing that God had a place for them in society. So we look at the peasants or most people, and you can see that they're living in small local communities under the protection of lords. And that's where we get the term landlord from today. And these lords, of course, would extract wealth from the peasants. In exchange, they would defend them and create some kind of an order. This was much more local and personal than an abstract idea of a Roman emperor and an army that operated far away. So this is the way that Middle Age society operated and took care of this issue. If we look at it in terms of spice, this is an issue of this is a political system. It's called feudalism. The word feud is a French term for a piece of land. Okay, the next is the age of chivalry. The code of chivalry for knights glorified combat and romantic love. Nobles were constantly at war with one another. They employed knights who were soldiers, who fought on horseback. Using the saddle and stirrup to stay firmly in place on the horse, these knights had become most important military weapons of the time in Europe. From about the year 1000, nobles used their armies of mounted knights to fight one another for control of land. When they won battles, they gave some of the new land to their knights. The knights could use income from the land to support their need for costly weapons, armor, and horses. They devoted much of their time to improving their skills in fighting. By the 1100s, a new code of conduct for knights had developed. This code became the code of chivalry, said that a knight had to fight fiercely for three masters: his lord, God, and his chosen lady. Knights were also required to protect the weak and poor. While the code set high standards, few knights met all of them. For example, most treated peasants harshly. The sons of nobles and knights began training to become knights at an early age. They gained experience by fighting in staged combats called tournaments. These fights were fierce, but real battles were very bloody and harsh. To protect their land and homes, nobles built stone castles. When a castle was attacked, defenders poured hot oil and boiling water on people trying to attack. Okay, so it gives you an idea of these ideas of local armies and made by knights, and the knights fought by a certain code. And they were very expensive to train these knights. Of course, think about how expensive a suit of armor would be that these knights would work. And that the focus was the defense of a castle, and these castles were fortifications found throughout Europe. The literature about knights did not reflect this bloody reality. Poems and stories stressed the code of chivalry, life in the castle, and knights' loyalty to the women he loved. Some long poems called epics told stories of real or legendary heroes, such as King Arthur and Charlemagne. Songs told of joys and sorrows of romantic love. Many writers of these songs traveled to the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the rich and powerful ruler of the land of southern France. The knight's ideas of love and devotion to the noble ladies seemed to give women a high position in society in the Middle Ages. In fact, most women in feudal societies had little power. The church taught that they were inferior. They were limited to working in homes and living in convents. Noble women could sometimes rule the land when their husbands were away from home, but they could not inherit land, and it usually passed from father to son. Peasant women had to work in the fields with their husbands and children simply to grow enough food to survive, just as they had always done. Okay, so if you've ever seen the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it plays a lot on this idea of medieval feudalism and knights and chivalry. I strongly recommend it. It's a pretty funny movie. All right, so then the last reading here is the power of the church. And as you recall, we talked about the church as like the glue that held medieval society together. With the central government of Europe weak, the church became the most important force unifying European society. An early pope had said that God had made two areas of influence in the world, religious and political. The pope was in charge of spiritual matters, he said, and the emperor and other rulers were in charge of political affairs. Over the years, though, the difference was not so clear. Popes often tried to influence the actions of rulers who clashed with them in the struggle for power. The church was organized into a structure that mirrored society. At the bottom were the priests who led services at local churches. Above them were bishops who oversaw the priests in large areas. And at the top was the Pope, the head of the church. Now, that structure still works in the Catholic Church today. With priest and a bishop, we have a bishop in Erie, and then, of course, the Pope in Rome still continues. The Middle Ages was an age of faith, when people were bound together by their belief in God and the teaching of the church. Though life was hard, the peasants hoped that by obeying God and doing their work, they would earn the reward of being saved and being taken into heaven after death. The local church served as both a religious and social center of the community. Holy days, or holidays as we call them, such as Easter and Christmas, were especially festive times of the year. The church developed a body of law called canon law. They set the standards for conduct of people and officials of the church. These laws ruled over such matters as marriage and religious practices. They applied to all Christians from kings to peasants. The church also set up courts that took charge when people broke these laws. Two punishments were especially harsh. If the church excommunicated a person, he or she was banished from the church. The person was denied a chance for eternal life in heaven. Popes often used this power as a threat to try to force rulers to do what they wanted. When a ruler refused to obey the Pope, the church would place his land under interdiction. This meant that no sacraments and religious services of the church could officially take place on those lands. The ruler's subjects deeply feared these punishments, for without the sacraments, they were all doomed to hell. So the idea of managing people's relationships with God gave the church incredible power. So if you could say, for example, your leader is not within God's law, then the obedience that people would have toward that leader would disappear, and that person would lose his political power. So the church had a very powerful sanction through interdiction and through excommunication. Otto I was the strongest ruler of medieval Germany. He set up an alliance with the church. In 962, this is about 150 years after Charlemagne, the Pope crowned him emperor of what became the powerful Holy Roman Empire. It was made up of what is now Germany and Italy. It was a little bit different that this Holy Roman Empire was a little further east than the one of Charlemagne, which included most of France and parts of Spain. Eventually, popes and emperors came into conflict. Rulers had for a long time enjoyed the power to name the bishops who led the church in their lands. In 1075 CE, Pope Gregory VII banned this practice. Emperor Henry IV was angry and persuaded his bishops to say that the Pope had no real authority. Gregory then excommunicated Henry. When Henry's nobles rebelled against him, he went to the Pope and actually begged for forgiveness. But the larger issue of lay investiture, that is, who had the right to give bishops the power, was left open until 1122. Then an agreement stated that only popes could name bishops. However, the emperor had the right to turn down any appointment he did not like. By the late 1100s, a new German ruler, Frederick I, tried to rebuild the power of the Holy Roman Empire. He invaded Italy, but was defeated in an important battle in 1176. When he died in 1190, his empire fell into pieces. Later kings tried to revive the empire. However, real power in Germany was held by German nobles. This idea of unity, you could see, was a continual struggle. So if you take a look at this section, we're talking about how the church really kind of mediated affairs with the state. It had a lot of, today we think of the church as a cultural institution, but it was really strongly a political institution too, with huge influence over the state during the time of the Middle Ages. So you look back down at these questions at the bottom. We looked at what were the effects of the arrival of Germans and the fall of the Roman Empire. We talked about how that the arrival of the Germans kind of destroyed Roman order and replaced it by a local order, and that Latin and Roman influences kind of mixed with the Germanic people that kind of inherited Europe. We talked about how Charlemagne attempted to try to rebuild Rome and rebuild the order and the philosophy and the educational system of Europe, but after his death, that his sons and grandsons split the empire up. And we know that periods of invasions that followed Charlemagne kind of shattered any political order there, and people turned to feudalism or local governments, depending on local landlords to protect them in exchange for essentially their freedom. A lot of people tied to the land as serfs, unable even to marry without the acknowledgement of their lord. And we could see that how important was the church. Since people were living in an age of faith, the church being a gateway to people's relationship with God, the church was a very powerful broker in political power. And of course, a lot of the wealth and power of the society was devoted to the church. And indeed, the Pope and the bishops he appointed were very, very powerful. Okay, folks, this reading is posted too if you want to go over before you take the quiz. But again, the last piece is we've looked at it, we scanned it, we had a purpose for reading, which was our questioning. We read it, and as we read, we stopped and we recited what we were learning relevant to our purpose, and we did that periodically. And when we were done, we kind of revisited what we were reading so that we will stick to our brain, and hopefully we'll really nail this quiz. All right, folks, good luck.